Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. What about the politics here, Monet? We've mentioned West Virginia's Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, not only a moderate who has called for permitting reform, but a guy who might decide that he wants to run for re-election in 2024, and he might be facing a challenge from Jim Justice, the state's very popular Republican governor. On the other hand, when Manchin was calling for this permitting reform last year, we still had a 50-50 Senate. So Manchin alone could have put that bill over the top if he and Republicans could have come to some kind of agreement. And now we no longer have a 50-50 Senate. And so, Monet, if we're going to get permitting reform done in this Congress, it is going to take more Democrats than only just Joe Manchin.
Exactly. I think to look at the political picture, it's worth noting that Republicans are playing with a very strong hand. Making energy easier to produce and lowering the cost is probably an 80% issue among the American public. And so they know that it's going to look very bad for a lot of Democratic senators to have to vote it down, or for Chuck Schumer to withhold it from a vote altogether. And so there's already going to be a lot of will, particularly for some of these Democrats in red states or moderate Democrats, to get on board. Particularly Joe Manchin, as you mentioned, has been the champion of permitting reform on the Democratic side, tried to put together a package that he hoped could pass, and then was kneecapped by the White House. And also, a lot of people in the energy industry didn't believe that his permitting bill went quite far enough because it didn't include these restrictions on litigation that sometimes is the real problem in tying up these proposals. So he is already in conversation with some of the Republicans who are leading the push in the House. That includes John Barrasso of Wyoming and Shelley Moore Capito, Joe Manchin's colleague from West Virginia. But there are others, including John Tester, who tend to be in favor of making it easier to produce energy, who are going to be voices for seeing if a deal can get done. I do think that one of the big blocks to a deal will be a couple provisions in the House Republican version, which would basically repeal a couple points from the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act created essentially a green bank, which is meant to fund green energy products with funding from the federal government being deployed by private developers, and that's about $27 billion. It also included a provision which created a new fee on methane emissions. And so Democrats in the Senate are going to really hesitate to immediately repeal some of these provisions from Joe Biden's signature piece of legislation, which they all just voted for themselves. And so that's going to be key to the negotiations. Can the Senate agree to modify or maybe even remove those provisions, which could theoretically be a poison pill? But it does seem as if permitting reform has a broad enough base of support in both parties that it's possible that they could all get together and decide to pass a skinnier version of H.R. 1 compared with what passed in the House. And if they do that, then President Biden will be under a lot of pressure to go ahead and sign it, because he knows that there are a lot of people in his party who are going to want to go home to their states and boast about what they've done to reduce energy prices.
What about President Biden's role here, Kim? Because if he came out in support of some kind of skinny version of permitting reform or some energy legislation, I can only imagine that that would increase the pressure on some of these Senate Democrats to vote for it and get it across the line. And so far in President Biden's tenure, we haven't seen much compromise, I think, from him on the energy issue. But a couple things I would point out. One is that White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain was recently replaced by Jeffrey Zients. Progressives have complained that Zients is not progressive enough for their taste, so maybe he would be more pragmatic on this issue. And two is that listeners might have noticed that a couple weeks ago, the White House approved the Willow drilling project on Alaska's North Slope. And Kim, I wonder if you can give us a sense of what that project is all about, and whether, in your view, the approval of that from the White House signals any change or any triangulation in Biden's stance here.
It's a great project, and this is a huge win for the country. It was the largest pending drilling project that was up for approval. It has been through so many reviews. What had happened is it had actually been approved. Then, as Monet mentioned, one of the big problems here, people sued against it, and environmental outfits sued. A liberal judge said that there hadn't been enough analysis of the environmental impact of the project. It went back to all the federal agencies who gave it a huge new review and approved it yet again. And so now, again, pending that litigation, the judge still has to sign off on this. It will go ahead. It's a project in Alaska's National Petroleum Reserve. As that name might indicate, this chunk of land was actually set aside by Congress for drilling. And yet the footprint of this drilling project will be a fraction of 1%. It's itty bitty. They're so good these days with directional drilling, just having a very small footprint and nonetheless managing to extract a lot of oil. So we are talking millions upon millions of barrels, which is going to flow through Alaska's pipeline, which will be good too, because that pipeline has had fewer volume going through it, which poses some risk to the pipeline itself. So all over a win. Now, does this mean that the White House has suddenly decided that it's going to be reasonable on energy? I don't think so. I think a couple of factors played into this. One, there was a united Democratic and Republican delegation, not just in the federal Congress, but in Alaska itself at the state legislature level, demanding this project because it's so important for Alaska's economy. Two, it would have been very unseemly for the White House to have vetoed a project that its own federal scientists had said was okay to proceed. And also, I think, too, Biden's trying to get away with this argument that it's developers who don't want to develop, not him, that he's issued lots of permits, they just won't drill. This really would have undercut that narrative. Do I think that means he's going to be willing to play ball with most of the provisions that are in this or come out in favor of a permitting change? I don't think so. And the reason why is he is still courting that progressive base, and climate is their religion. And, maybe he will moderate on some other things, but this one, on the whole climate initiative, he's geared his whole of government around this climate project, and I just don't see him backing down and agreeing to some of the things that are in this bill.
To play devil's advocate, though, and Monet will give you the last word, President Biden, when he ran in 2020, played seriously to the progressive base, but that was in part because he didn't have the nomination locked up. And now he's going into re-election mode. All the signs, all the signals are that he's going to run again in 2024, and that he's probably going to run without any serious Democratic challenger. And so that frees him up maybe to play a little bit more toward the center. And it's possible, I think, that he could get some pressure on this issue. Let me check the AAA national average gas prices. And the day after President Biden's inauguration, $2.39 a gallon, and as of today, $3.46, which is a big bump, though I would note that those figures are not adjusted for inflation. And Monet, we've also had some pretty good inflation, which I suppose feeds into voters' perception of the Biden record as well.
Right. I do think that's a little optimistic, and of course you're playing devil's advocate. I think that President Biden really does believe that renewables are not just the future, but are the present, which has become basically a very, very firm plank of the entire Democratic Party's outlook over the course of the past 8 years or so. There really is not a ton of appetite for any kind of broad policy that would shore up American oil and gas production. Yes, you'll still see permits being issued from project to project, but I think that's very different from a broader reform bill, which is intended to boost fossil fuel production. I think he would have a lot of donors within the party, a lot of the more progressive representatives and senators complaining. And I also think that he himself has internalized that value. And so I think that things like permitting reform, where it's not only going to benefit oil and gas, but also would ease permitting for environmental projects too, that's what he might potentially play ball on. But I think some of the provisions in H.R. 1 are going to be a very, very tough sell for him, and probably would have to be matched with additional provisions for enhancing renewables if he was going to get on board.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.